Hello crafty friends, it's Jess from jesscrafts.com, and today I have a winter card as part of the design team at Butterfly Reflections Inc. This is actually going to be my last post as a design team member because my term is ending at the end of December, but I do hope that I can stop by and guest in the future. And so for this card, I am using the WPlus9 Winter Pals stamps and dies. As soon as I saw those stamps, I knew I had to have them. Their images are really adorable, and since Vanessa carries some of the latest and greatest, I knew that I could go to her shop to pick them up. And so I've stamped them out with my favorite things, Black Licorice Hybrid ink, and I am going to stamp some extra of the trees because I'm not quite sure how many I'm going to use. You might see there on the left of the screen that I have a little bit of a sketch to kind of think out what my idea might be. I have an idea in my head of what I want the finished card to look like, but I'm never quite sure how it's going to end up, and so I like to have some extra so I don't have to go back and make more later. I'm going to use some washi tape to tape the dies down to my paper. I do have a Sizzix magnetic plate, but unfortunately, as your plates warp, the magnetic plate doesn't hold the dies precisely. And so I prefer to just tape them down when it's, in these instances, when it's important that they match up perfectly. I also personally like to die cut my images before I color them, because that way, if I make a mistake with my die cutting, I haven't ruined an image that I spent a lot of time coloring. Although these images are very small and they do color up quickly, so if that happened, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. You could color it up again easily. And so I'm just adding a little bit of tape to each one. As you see, I'm going to have to run it through a couple of times in order to cut out all of those trees, but once you get going, it becomes a quick process. And so after this, I'm going to start coloring some of the images. I will be also using the memory box stencil, the winter tiny snowflake stencil that you see over there to the left, to add some snowflakes to my final winter scene. And so here are all the images cut out. I'm not going to show you the coloring of everything because with the penguin I had a little bit of a mishap where my W5 marker was a little too full and it was leaking out onto the project, and so yeah, I was making a big mess and it would be kind of a waste of time for you to watch all of that. So I'm just showing you how I colored the ice using C1, C3, and C00. And I'm also going to be coloring the fox. The way I colored the fox is pretty similar to the way that I colored the penguin. I'm using 2 shades of YR markers, which are orange markers, and for the penguin I used 2 colors of W markers. And I added the darker shadows where the different areas of the fox or the penguin meet, like where their head meets their body, would have a little bit of a shadow. And so I just used those kind of simple principles on these smaller images. And on these smaller images, I tend to color from dark to light rather than light, dark, light, which can give you better blending, but in a small image like this, the more ink you add, the more likely you are to get some bleeding outside of the lines. And so I find that it's a little bit easier to just do 2 applications of color, dark and then light. I'm also using W1 and W00 to add a little bit of color to the white areas of the fox because I don't like to leave the white areas pure white. I think that by blending them out with a really light shade of gray, it actually creates a better look. For the sky, I am going to be using some Distress ink in Salty Ocean and Broken China. While you could just use one color of Distress ink, I find that images and cards look better when there's just a little bit of variation in interest. So I chose to go with the 2 colors. I'm just taking the round ink blender and smushing the ink on. I don't worry too much about the way that I apply it in terms of like starting from the edge of the page and blending in. And that was a big concern back when there was the rectangular ink applicators, but now that there's the round ink applicators, they don't create such a harsh edge, and so there is no real trick or anything to putting on Distress ink. You can just place it on in any way that you need and then the only tip I guess I would have is to make sure that you overlap the colors so that they create a blend, but in terms of using a certain kind of motion, there's no need for that. And so after I've placed the color down, I am going to make sure to dry the Distress ink completely, because I will be putting some embossing paste over the distressed ink area, and distress ink can be used to color embossing paste, so if the distress ink isn't completely dry, it could turn the embossing paste colors, and that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking to create some crisp white snowflakes with this stencil. I really like the stencil for embossing paste because the image areas, the cutouts, are so small that it really works well, and you don't have to worry too much about fussing with the embossing paste a lot. You can just sweep it over and it's going to give a nice clean look. When you have bigger holes with your stencil, I think that it's a little bit more tricky to make sure that everything is smoothed out and even. So I think this one is a quick and easy one to use for the different techniques, and you don't have to have a lot of experience with embossing paste to get a great look with this. Simply spread it on like icing. I find personally that I like to pull from the top of the stencil down to get the best effect, and then I'll scrape off as much as I can and place it back in the container so that I don't have any waste and my embossing paste will last me a longer time. I'm going to lift up the stencil and be sure to bring it right over to the sink to wash it so that the embossing paste doesn't dry onto the stencil, as it can get quite hard. I want to add some shimmer to the snowbank. I will be creating a snowbank underneath the sky, and I created that with the Lawn Fawn stitched hillside border. I'm using the Lawn Fawn stitched rectangles for the main panel of the card. I have some perfect pearls here that I'm just going to mix up. You could also get perfect pearl powder and mix it with water to create the same effect, but I happen to have the shimmer spray, and I'm going to hold it about a foot above my paper and spray it down. I have in the past held it closer, and I was getting frustrated because there were much darker splotches in some areas than others, and I realized after getting some tips from different YouTubers, things like that, that if I held my spray bottle farther away, I would get more of an even fine mist coverage. And so I definitely recommend experimenting with that, and about a foot above seems to work. I'm going to adhere the hillside onto the embossing paste background, and I want to make sure that the embossing paste is completely dry, so I left mine for a couple of hours, but you could also hit it with a heat gun to make sure that it was dry and so that it won't smush. And now I'm just going to assemble all of those die cut pieces to create my winter scene. In the end, I decided to go with just the 3 trees. Things generally tend to look better in odds, so I had a feeling I'd probably wind up only using 3. For the trees, I used E37 and E35 and just made it a little bit darker at the bottom and the 35 towards the top. I'm going to frame the scene with the trees to the left where I want to fill the space a little bit more, but because on the right I will be adding the pond, I needed a little bit of extra room for my critter. I had thought originally about putting the sentiment up in the sky, but then when I went with the embossing paste snowflakes, I realized that wouldn't be possible, so I'm being sure to leave a little bit of extra room for this sending warm hugs sentiment right here in the bottom left underneath the penguin. I'm going to stamp that down with some Ranger Archival Jet Black ink. I always have a little bit of hesitance when I wait till the last step to stamp like this, because if I mess up my stamping a little bit, it could potentially ruin the card, but you don't have to worry that much about it because you could always come in with a thin black pen and draw over the sentiment. So I definitely understand the trepidation with waiting for the last minute to stamp a sentiment, but always try to keep that in the back of your mind that you can fix those little stamping mistakes as long as you have a pen that matches. I decided to go with some glossy accents here for the ice to give it more of an actual ice look. When you're covering a large surface like this with glossy accents, you have to be careful because it can be quite easy to get air bubbles, and I do wind up with some air bubbles in the final product, but I don't worry too much about it. I know that these little imperfections are okay in handmade cards, but just try to be careful, and you can also poke holes, like take a needle and poke the air bubbles, and that should help if you have any concerns with that. I'm going to put a thin mat of purple to bring out the purple in the earmuffs and the scarf on the animals, and that's it for my card today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're interested in seeing more crafty videos, you can subscribe to my channel. I'm going to leave you a link in the description box below to the Butterfly Reflections Inc. blog where you can check out these products and do a little bit of holiday shopping. Thanks for watching. Bye.